You're listening to The Artist Athlete, episode 147. This podcast is dedicated to Circus. It's a place for professionals in the industry to share their stories, viewpoints, and information, and a place for outsiders to get a sneak peek into this world. Hey, friends, fans, and foes. I'm Shannon McKenna, and I'm the host of the Artist Athlete podcast. This is a long episode, so I'm just going to get right into it. But before I do, I have to say, I think I love the first 5 minutes of this interview. It's probably one of my favorite things I've ever recorded because Bryan says so much about not only himself, but the reality of what it's like to work in the industry. Like not getting off work until 2:30 a.m., getting an hour and a half of sleep, and then getting on a flight is like the most relatable content for anyone who has worked in this industry. And I created this podcast to tell deeply human stories behind the superhuman art form. So, Bryan, I really hope you don't mind that I kept this part in. I seriously did very little editing to this episode. I usually take out specific references or lists or things that kind of muddle the overall message, but interviewing Bryan felt like getting a chance to record a piece of circus history at a very particular moment that often gets overlooked. My guest today is Bryan Donaldson. Bryan comes from a third-generation theatrical family background in New Zealand. Bryan traveled the world as an aerial artist and rigger with touring circus companies for many years, establishing an accomplished and respected reputation as part of Duo Vertigo. In 2003, he co-founded High Performance Rigging and now teaches the popular course Rigging Fundamentals for Aerial Performance and continues working and developing techniques for aerial rigging. He was the aerial director on the Olivier Award-winning Zorro the Musical world premiere, the circus consultant on Disney's Dumbo for director Tim Burton, flying consultant on Billy Elliot the Musical, the world premiere, and the circus consultant for the Warner Brothers Batman Live World Arena Tour. Without further ado, here is my interview with Bryan Donaldson. Bryan Donaldson, welcome to the Artist Athlete podcast.
Thank you very much. It's I feel very privileged to be here.
I feel privileged to have you.
Oh, fantastic.
Let's start off real simple. Who are you? What do you do?
My name is Bryan, and I co-direct a company in London called High Performance Rigging, and we specialise in the installation of aerial equipment for circus performers and performer flying. That's it pretty much in a nutshell.
Nice and succinct. Have you always been a rigger?
No, not at all. Well, rigging is something that was part of the job when I was touring and working as an aerialist in the circus. But I started off in the business, actually in the circus business, as a magician. When I was actually, Shannon, can we just stop for a second?
Yeah, you all right?
Yeah. No, listen. I was working all day yesterday, and I've had about 1.5 hours sleep, and my brain's a bit fuzzy, to be honest. I was away in London all last week, and we had an event last night at the Roundhouse in London, and I didn't actually get to bed till 2:30 in the morning, and then I was up at 4 to get a flight back to Dublin, and drove. So I've had about 1.5 hours sleep. My brain isn't in the right space for this. I thought it would be, but it isn't. Maybe hang on. Maybe I just need to take a couple of deep breaths and just chill out.
Yeah, take some deep breaths.
Yeah.
Why don't we have the hour now?
Yeah.
Unless you plan to fall over and go to sleep this instant.
No, not at all.
Why don't we take the hour, do the recording, see what happens?
Yeah.
And if at the end of it, we're both like, you know what, that was total trash, we'll just scrap it.
Yep, no, cool. That sounds good. I just found myself just then when I started talking, I wasn't talking, it wasn't flowing naturally. I just started overthinking things, and then all of a sudden, it's just, I felt, oh my goodness, I think I'm going to get myself tongue-tied here. Has that ever happened to guests of yours before?
Oh my God, completely. I think, when you're running And
Yeah.
like the first like 10 minutes are absolute hell. And you're
Yeah.
just like, the fuck am I doing? This sucks. And then you kind of get into a rhythm
And
and
then you
you
work
like
through it. You
go.
work through it. Yeah.
I think that's
Good.
how these episodes sometimes go,
Yeah.
where it's like, I mean, obviously, like there's brain fog and like fatigue is real, and
Yeah.
you've got a whole other load of factors going on there. Yeah, it's a bit weird to like know you're being recorded. The reason I actually hit recording at the beginning,
Yeah.
aside from the fact I'm scared I'm going to lose it,
Yeah.
is because when I hit record,
Yeah.
all of a sudden my guest, like there's this energy shift that happens to them.
Yes. Yeah.
And so what I want to do is like get rid of that shift so they can feel as comfortable as possible, which is why I hit record and then start talking
Yeah.
instead of like give you the intro and be like, okay, are you ready? And then hit record and then we start.
Yeah, because I suppose that
like
probably
another-
puts a bit more pressure on, doesn't it? When people are then
That's
right,
it.
okay, it's a countdown, 3, 2, and
Yeah,
we're
exactly.
live.
And now you're on. Whereas like I don't want people to feel
Yeah.
like they have to be on. I just
Yeah.
want like it to go. So like
Yeah.
like there's all sorts of buffers and things I do to account for it, but it's
Yeah.
still there, you know?
Yeah.
Can't get rid of it.
Cool.
Also,
All
I
right.
might just leave all of this in the podcast because I think it's really good. And I think
Great.
people are really interested in like
Yeah.
how the what is it, the sauce is made or whatever? Like, what is
Yeah.
it like to be interviewed? What does it feed, you know? It's
Yeah.
weird. It's a weird
Yeah.
thing to like sit down and talk about yourself.
Well, I don't normally find it difficult to talk about myself, to be honest. I mean, yeah, I think, you know, sort of as a person in show business, I think it's something that we all need to be able to do. You know, it's like,
Oh my God, that's so true.
yeah,
But acrobats are not great at it, to be honest.
Well, yeah, I suppose, because I mean, normally, well, traditionally, I suppose in circus, acrobats, they're not delivering, you know, a line. They're not talking as such. You know, it's more of a physical display as opposed to the gift of the gab.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But no,
like-
I mean, it should be more. I guess it should be more taken as just having a conversation, you know, instead of like a formal interview.
I mean, yeah. This is the weird thing is like, yeah, exactly. Like I do the same thing to people even when there's no microphone in front of me. I like ask the same kind of questions.
Yeah.
I like sit down and we'll just like have it. Like I'm the person who corners someone at a party and just like ask them all the questions about their life.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I feel like it's just me doing that, but in my bathroom with a sock over a microphone.
Is that where you are? You're sitting in your bathroom? Oh my God, that's your toilet.
Yeah.
I just realised.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
This is my shower curtain right here.
Let's start that again then, shall we? Let's try that again. Good. All right.
I mean, we can, but we can just say, so you were a magician.
Yeah, well,
magicians
I mean,
are the best.
Yeah, how I started off in the circus is quite interesting because I started, well, at quite a young age. I developed an interest in magic and theatre, and then over the years, all I wanted to do was, you know, my focus was to be a magician or to be on stage, or my mother's side of the family were in theatre. So I was always brought up in that environment. And then over the years, I realised that the academic side of things wasn't really working for me. I moved around a lot as a kid. My parents split up when I was quite young, and so we moved about every 2 years. And so I went to a lot of different schools. I think like from the age of like starting school until when I finished school, I went to about 8 different schools in total. So I never really settled into the whole educational side of things, and I just wanted to be in show business. I joined up with the Magic Club when I was probably about 12 or 13 years old, and joined up in New Zealand. There's a club there where I lived in the Waikato called the Waikato Magic Circle, and I joined up with the Junior Wizards Club, and was with them for probably about 3 or 4 years. And then I left school quite young. I was about 15 when I left school, and I decided I was going to go out and make my fortune as a magician. And I started working the odd gigs,
as you do, you know, make millions in that magic money.
Started getting the odd gigs here and there, doing shopping centres and all sorts of things, kids' birthday parties and festivals in New Zealand. And I got a phone call one day from the treasurer of the Waikato Magic Circle, who said the circus had come to town and that they were looking for a magician. Would I be interested in, you know, going along and having a look? And I said, oh yeah, sounds interesting. So I went along and met up with the boss of the circus, and he offered me a contract there and then for just a couple of weeks while they were in town. And it all worked out really, really well, and I enjoyed it. And next thing I know, he said, look, we're going to be going on the road. Would you be interested in coming on the road with us? And that's how I stumbled into circus. It was never anything that I had sort of planned to do. It was never an ambition of mine to get into the circus business.
What do you think it is about magic and circus? Because they go together. You know, they're like so completely
Yeah, I don't know,
complementary. But I've never really put my finger
yeah, I mean,
on
to be honest, I
why.
actually found it really difficult because as a magician, I mean,
Huh.
as a magician, normally, well, traditionally, you'd have your audience in front of you, and all the dirty work goes on behind. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Whereas
true.
in the circus, of course,
Yeah.
you've got people sitting around in sort of a 360-degree format, or traditionally around the circus ring. And so I really had to think quite carefully about, what it was that I was going to be presenting. It's like, and think of the angles, because I'd
Mm,
always rehearsed and always performed front on, with the audience in front of me. And so, your sleight of
right.
hand and your palming and all that sort of stuff goes on behind the scenes. And that's because the audience can't see behind you. But in the circus, of course, that's not the case. So yeah, I found that quite interesting. So I had to adapt my routine to fit into the circus ring. But I don't know quite what it is. But I know, like, the boss of the circus that I was working for in New Zealand at the time, he loved magic, and he always tried to bring magicians into the circus. He loved illusions. I was doing sort of more of the small scale, sort of cabaret style magic with the rings and the canes, and I used doves and rabbits as well. And yeah, sort of while I was touring around, I mean, obviously I met the other artists and I saw all the different disciplines that were going on. And yeah, sort of just got fascinated by it, really. And obviously, in a sort of a touring traditional show, quite often what the circuses will do is, instead of changing their tour routes, they'll bring new acts in. And so this particular
Mhm.
season, towards the end of the season, the boss was looking at bringing in a new aerial act, and he had sent off to an agent in the States. This was back in the days before the internet, obviously. And so what they used to do is send in VHS,
Yeah.
show reels of all the different performers and what have you. And there's one particular act that had been sent over from the States, and it was a couple, and they were doing 2 or 3 different acts. And one of the acts that they did was an aerial act, and it was like a sort of a solid trapeze style swing, and you'd swing it backwards and forwards, and it would end up ultimately going around doing 360 loops. And he said, "Do you reckon if I got that prop made up that you might be able to do that?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know, but I'll give it a go." So he took that literally, and he went down to an engineer and got the prop made up and rigged it up. And before I knew it, he brought me into the tent. He said, "Well, there it is. Do you want to get up and have a go?" So I climbed up and started pushing it and swung it. And he said, "Don't go too crazy. Take it easy. Be careful." But I ended up, as a teenager, not paying him too much heed. And I swung it all the way around, went around 360 degrees. And he was like, "Oh, that's brilliant. We'll put that in the show tonight." So it was literally a baptism of fire. And that was the introduction for me into the world of aerial. So I ended up touring with that show in New Zealand for a couple of years. It was 1993 is when I first came over to the UK. I'd met a girl in the circus in New Zealand. She actually was just walking past the field where the circus was, and she'd stopped to pet a pony. And the boss offered her a job while the circus was in town. He said, "Oh, do you want to sort of help groom the ponies?" And so she ended up coming on the road for a week or so, and we ended up as a couple. She became my girlfriend, and she dropped out of university and carried on touring with the circus. Now, obviously, her parents weren't particularly happy with that. And they left the country because they were her father was from Scotland, and they took her with them when their visa was up. They were just over there on a 2-year working visa, and it was a couple of months later that I followed her over to the UK and hooked up with her again, much to her parents' dismay.
Great story, by the way. We love a romance. How did you find the circus in New Zealand different than the one in the UK?
Well, the circus industry in New Zealand, I mean, when I was working there anyway, was very small. There were only actually 2 touring shows on the road at the time. And they were like your very small traditional touring, style circuses. The show that I worked on had an elephant, and it had monkeys, and it had ponies, and it had lions. And basically
Oh, wow.
everyone did everything. The boss of the circus, he presented the elephant, he presented the ponies, he did the whip cracking. His wife had actually left when I met him, but she did a high school act, and she used to do the trapeze act as well. And then when I first met him, he was actually saying, "We need an aerial act." And he said, "But my wife used to do it and she's left." So then I said, "Well, why don't you put an advert in the paper and advertise for a trapeze artist?" I mean, at that time, don't forget, I mean, there just weren't trapeze artists in New Zealand. There weren't. I mean, there they didn't even have a circus school, So there's no, there's not exactly like a resource, a pool of artists that you could just call on. So I mean, obviously, you hit a glass ceiling pretty quickly, and in shows like that, because there just isn't. You don't. I mean, you don't have the inspiration. You don't have other things. I mean, YouTube didn't exist at the time, for example, so there was nothing to see, to draw inspiration from. But obviously, I mean, that if you are going to be working in that business, you need to be somewhere like the States or Europe where circus is happening,
Yeah.
And when I did get to the UK and I saw the shows over there, I was absolutely blown away by the, sort of like how professional it was, and how, sort of all the costuming was immaculate, and the detail given to the production side of things, the lighting and the sound and the choreography was all stuff that, was just a million miles away from what I had experienced in the circus in New Zealand. Now, obviously that's changed now, sort of like the current climate of circus in New Zealand now is a lot different. The shows that I've seen since over the years, I've been away for over 30 years now from New Zealand, and the standard has improved a lot, obviously.
But it's such a good point you make about just like career development, and like if you want to see stuff or like be in it, you really do have to go to a place, even if your ultimate plan is to go back to wherever you're from. I do think that like you do really have to spend a time like in a place where they really invest in the industry in a really high level way.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. And that was never going to happen in that environment that I was working in New Zealand. It was just basically sort of like eking out a living. It was probably there was no sort of invested interest into really, I don't know, improving things, I suppose, to a standard, for artistic reasons necessarily. It was just all about making money or making a living at the time.
So you followed this girl.
I followed this girl.
Like, love
so
story.
Anyway, I followed this girl.
And then what was your, like, how did you get in with the circuses in the UK? Did you show up and were like, right, who's going to hire me? Like, how did that work?
She went to see a show. Now, when I first came over, she'd got a job working in a bar. And that's what Kiwis did back then. They came to the UK, they got a job working in a pub. They came, because normally you get like a 2-year working permit. Now, I was lucky. I happened to be born in the UK. My parents went over to England. They got a 2-year working visa when they were young, and I happened to be born whilst they were out there. And so, at that time, if you were born in the UK, it meant that you got automatic entitlement to citizenship.
Wait, is that not true anymore?
No, not now. You don't. It's you still. You'd have to be born to. I think one of your parents would have to be a UK citizen.
Oh wow!
It's not just automatic entitlement now. If you're born there.
Yeah, because the US has automatic entitlement as well.
Yes. No, you do, don't you? Yeah. I mean, you don't have one of the parents doesn't have to necessarily be a US citizen as such.
Nope.
No. Yeah. Because I had been born in the UK meant that I could stay when I did eventually get over there. Meant that I could stay and I didn't have to worry about sort of going back. So traditionally, like I said, Kiwis would go out to New Zealand. Out to the UK. They'd work for a couple of years. Normally, get a bar job because it provided accommodation as well as food and a wage. They'd save their money, then they'd tour around Europe and they'd go back to New Zealand, get married, have kids, buy a house, and live their life. I started off, doing the thing that the Kiwis do, just because, it was a tried and tested formula. And I can't remember what bar, because we had 2 or 3 different bar jobs, but one of the days, my girlfriend Melanie, she went off to see Jerry Cottle Circus. And while she was there, she got chatting to one of the guys, one of the performers. And it turned out that he and his brother had recently bought a Wheel of Death. And and
just casually, you do.
And off some other artists.
Yeah. Okay.
Whilst they were rehearsing, one of the brothers fell off and broke his leg.
Ugh.
But they'd already secured a contract, you see, and so they had to deliver an act. And this was working for a circus in a theme park in England called Chessington World of Adventures. And they had a Moroccan show that had been there since the 1960s called Circus Hassani as part of the theme park. And so these 2 lads, they were the Campbell brothers. There's Neville and Richard Campbell. Richard, the older brother, he'd fallen off and broken his leg whilst learning and rehearsing. And so my girlfriend casually mentioned, well, my boyfriend does a little bit of aerial acrobatics if you're looking for a partner. And so he said, yeah, sure, we'll bring him along and we'll have a chat. So she came back and told me this, and I said, oh, this could be great. This could be a way to get out of the bar and get back into the circus. Because when I'd seen the stand of the shows, sort of having come from New Zealand to England, I thought, oh, there's no way that I'm going to get into these shows, sort of with the skill level that I have, because the skill level there is already so much higher. And so anyway, I went along to Jerry Cottle's winter quarters, which was in Addleston Moor in Surrey, met Neville and met his brother, met a few of his friends there at the winter quarters, and he decided to give me a try out on the wheel. So we turned up, and we had a caravan at the time, so we turned up and we parked the caravan on the site of the winter quarters, and began to rehearse. And coming into winter, when we were rehearsing outdoors, and he had the wheel built up on legs outdoors. And I remember particularly this one morning, it was so foggy. We were practicing on the wheel, and it was so foggy that I couldn't actually see him on the other end of the wheel as it was going around.
My God.
Anyway, yeah. At that age, sort of like, I think I was about 20 at the time. Sort of like, obviously you don't have that same level of fear that you do as you get older and you realise your own mortality. So you just go with it, And so we rehearsed there probably for not long, maybe, 2 or 3 weeks. And then we managed to get the nuts and bolts of an act together within that time frame. Then, we went and took it to the circus and worked and performed there at Chessington. That was in 1994, which was my introduction to the world of, UK British circus. And it was through that I then began to meet a lot of other people, from that sort of classical traditional circus background. And it's amazing that just how they all know each other, how it is such a small world, and all the kids and all the families, they all grow up, sort of like working on each other's shows. And as youngsters, they all like sort of learnt together and developed their skills together as well. And I found it was a really close-knit, friendly sort of environment amongst those people, amongst those families.
It's really interesting. Like, I remember working on like the difference between working on trad circuses and working in like kind of like the contemporary biz is like in trad circuses, the conversations are like, oh yeah, I worked with your uncle back in 1987 on this thing. And is your grandfather this person? They taught my niece how to juggle at this one thing. Like there is really so much more like of this like familial and generational connectedness.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Whereas like, I feel like in contemporary, like you get a lot of like, it's a lot of like, oh yeah, I dated him for a while. Or like that.
Absolutely. It's quite different. No, it is. It is quite different. I mean, see, I didn't even know of the existence of contemporary circus, back then. The only thing that I knew was traditional circus. And I hadn't actually been introduced to the world of, back then they called it new circus in the UK. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were two very definitely different camps at the time. There's, your traditional circus, and then there was your new circus. I became aware of that a little bit later on down the line. We worked that season, and then during that season we went off to see other shows, because we were young, we had loads of energy. We'd be doing 2 or 3 shows a day, and then getting in the car that night and then driving off all over the countryside to see other shows. But that was great for me because I met other people. I was introduced to other people, and and went to see how things were done differently on other shows, which is a really good learning curve for me as well. One of the shows that we went to see was up in Blackpool, and where they have a fixed building show called the Blackpool Tower Circus. I think it's one of only 2 that still exist in the UK now. There's one in Great Yarmouth, and then there's the one up in Blackpool, the Blackpool Tower Circus building. And so we managed to secure a contract for the Christmas season up there, which we did after the season at Chessington. And it was while I was up there that I actually met a girl that did trapeze, a Scottish girl. By this stage, actually, I forgot to mention, So the girl that I was with in New Zealand, all right?
Yeah. This is the part that I live for. Let's go.
The girl that I was with in New Zealand, okay, so whilst I was working on that show at Chessington World Adventures, she ended up going and working on Jerry Cottle's circus with the horses, because that was her background in New Zealand, was working with horses, you see. And we, for some reason, decided to get married. Now, she was only, I think, God, we were so young, like 21 or something. We probably never should have gotten married, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. I thought, great, we'll have a party under the big top. So all the guests turned up in full costume. We're down at the registry office, actually got married at the registry office, and back to the circus tent for the reception. But everyone turned up in the registry office like full clown makeup, full showgirl makeup, everything. And anyway, so that was that. And then whilst I was working at Chessington and she was working with Jerry Cottle's circus, or it was called the Cottle Sister Circus at the time, actually, she met a ringmaster from another circus and she ran off with him.
No, Bryan.
We'd only been married for 4 months. No, so it's absolutely fine. It's sort of, to be honest, it's actually sort of like long term. It's great because it's sort of like it's sort of like made for a great sort of like, story.
It's a good story.
It's like,
it's a good story.
She ran away with the ringmaster. It's like, oh, you couldn't actually write about that, could you? Anyway, so by this stage, this was a few months later. We'd gone up to the Blackpool Tower Circus to do the Christmas season, and I'd met this Scottish trapeze artist, and we ended up getting together. And she had been taught, she came a ballet dance background, and she'd gotten into circus quite late. I think she was in her 20s, in her sort of mid-20s when she started doing trapeze. She has been trained by a Dutch woman, Rita van Opselen, who used to be an aerialist, and she worked on one of the original Chaos shows. She was doing more of the gymnastic style swing and trapeze, where they're jumping off and doing pirouettes and catching the bar. So it was a completely different style of trapeze than what I'd ever seen before. Obviously I've seen sort of like your traditional style trapeze where they didn't even wear a safety line. And they're doing sort of like more transitional moves like back balances and toe hangs and heel hangs and all that sort of stuff. And anyway, so I'd never seen that style of trapeze before. But what made it interesting for me is obviously sort of like doing the bigger tricks and taking the bigger risks meant that she utilized a safety line, which, at the time, a lot of the traditionalists would say, well, yeah, you're not really doing it, if you're wearing a safety line. It's like, well, yeah, how much do you value your life there, Right. That was a real transitional thing, for me at the time as well, sort of coming from that sort of trad circus background, crossing over and meeting Juliet at the time, who had come from more the contemporary circus background and actually had gone to a circus school, whereas I didn't even realise that circus schools existed up until that point. I mean, we certainly didn't have one in New Zealand. It wasn't until later years that they actually had a circus school, which doesn't exist anymore because it got knocked down in the earthquake. But
oh, no. Oh, shit. That sucks.
And they never rebuilt it. But anyway.
It's a bit of an oxymoron, I think. Circus school. I don't know.
Yeah.
I know it's like a jumbo shrimp. It's like, are these two words? They kind of cancel each other out in a way. But okay, so you met Juliet.
Yes, met Juliet, and we ended up. Well, she had a contract for the following season touring with the show. Now, the reason I didn't carry on with doing the wheel act is that my partner, he actually fell off during the show whilst we were performing at the Blackpool Tower Circus. It was a second show on Boxing Day, and he fell, and it was a fatal fall. And I know, and I only just sort of like recently got together with Juliet, and so I kind of landed this on her saying, so what are you doing next season? Do you mind if I come with you? Obviously, I'm not going to be doing the wheel act anymore. That was...
Wait a second. What? You don't have to talk about this if you don't want to. But
no, it's fine. It's fine.
What is
something
that?
That's just... Sorry?
How do you deal with that?
Well, I don't.
Aside from drinking a lot, which is how I would deal with it.
Yeah, maybe to be honest, I don't know. I mean, I didn't know, how to deal with it. I guess I don't know if I ever really did deal with it. I mean, it was a long time ago now. It was over 30 years ago. But yeah, I mean, it's just 1 minute he's there and then the next minute he's not. I mean, it was the last part of the act, and the last part of the act, he used to go onto the outside of the wheel, and the pace would pick up and he'd do bigger jumps and everything, and he was very incredibly talented. I mean, he's from a circus family, and he used to do hand balancing and acrobatics and all that sort of stuff, and is always very, very proud of what he was doing, and the act had evolved really, really nicely throughout the year. I worked out that we'd actually done over 1,400 performances just the year that we were at the theme park in Chessington World of Adventures with Circus Hasani. But yeah, so I mean, it was that last part of the act, and I'm on the inside sort of pushing it around while he's on the outside, and I felt I just felt the wheel go light all of a sudden, where I
Yeah.
didn't feel that resistance.
Yeah.
And I didn't actually see it. I just, like I said, I just felt it. I think he was probably above or behind me at the time. And then all of a sudden the wheel just whipped around, and I just saw him lying there on the ground. And I mean, I'd learnt, sort of that if someone falls onto a hard surface, we'd had another accident in the show that I was working on in New Zealand as well, where someone fell off the trapeze, and the boss went running over and picked him up, and the doctor in the audience said, no, don't touch him. He's got a broken neck or a broken back.
Right.
You just leave him there until he's assessed. That kicked in for me when I saw Neville there on the ground. I was like, don't touch him. Unfortunately, there was a doctor that did come out of the audience, and he didn't have a pulse, so he was pronounced dead at the scene. And that was...
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it was... it's a very overwhelming thing, There was just so much happening in my life at that time. It was all new and it was all exciting, and I'd had, various things going on. And then this was just, was something that was pretty unreal. Juliet, bless her, she'd had a contract, and then all of a sudden she was supposed to be going off to do this, and I kind of just landed myself on her, really. And but anyway, so we went off that following season to do a show. Well, it was a touring UK show put on by a guy called Philip Gandy, and it was a show called Cirque du Soleil. That was the first time actually that I'd seen a new style circus where it wasn't done in a traditional format. There wasn't a ring with sawdust, with animals, with clowns, that sort of thing. They brought over a contemporary company from France called the Mauvais Esprit that had incredibly high skill level, but they were just doing things in a completely different way that I'd never seen anything like it before, using movement and using dance and working together, in a company doing ensemble stuff, as opposed to just a very sort of individual act style formula. So we had a really good international cast of people. There was a hand balancer from Russia called Sasha, and we had an amazing juggler called Carlos Ortiz from Mexico, and he did the Mexican hats and the really high-speed juggling, just to put a little bit of, trad circus into the contemporary show. A beautiful Russian couple called Sergei and Masha that did a rope, sort of semi-rope strap act, and it was just such a lovely mix of different styles that was then put together in a format that I'd never seen before, with music and no ringmaster. One act blended into the next act. And it was basically Gandy doing Soleil before Soleil got big in the UK. He wanted to put them to the post and called it Cirque Surreal. And it was a really, really nice show. It was a lovely show, and we toured the UK. From there, I basically decided that, I needed to get into doing something a little bit more real, as far as, if I'm going to be an aerialist or a circus performer, I need something that I can do that is going to be good, and I had previously done obviously the wheel act, but I was with Juliet now, and I wanted to work up in the air, and she was doing amazing things and was so beautiful and elegant. Juliet had come from a classically trained dance background. She trained at the Royal Academy of Dance, and I had no training whatsoever. So So the director of the show, the choreographer, wanted to incorporate me into the show somehow. So they put me into a costume to complement Juliet's lovely costume. And he's like, okay, so you're going to walk into the ring with her. And then he saw me walk. He was like, oh my God, okay, what? Right, where do we start? And it's like, I came sort of just waltzing in like this, and there's Juliet walking in beautiful sort of ballet fashion. He just put his hands over his eyes and shook his head, and it's like, okay, there's a lot of work to do here. It was a good ice-breaking exercise for me to see the quality of of the artists in that show and see what was possible. And this was 1995 back then. I'd never seen anything like it before, I think the best show that I'd seen up to that point was a touring show of the Moscow State Circus that came to New Zealand. But this was something different,
It's also kind of a testament to, like, it doesn't matter your skill level. If you just hang around long enough, they'll put you in the show.
But see, that's the thing now. I think when I got into the circus, I think it was probably at that point where you could still run away with a circus. Whereas now, I wouldn't get a look in the door now if I wanted to get into the business now. I mean, obviously the standard is so much higher now just because of the fact that there are so many training institutions around the place now, and the skill level is phenomenal. Back then, you could actually run away with a circus and you could learn the skills that you needed on the road. And I think I was just on the cusp where that was changing. So I got in at the right time, really. There's another troupe that had come over for that season as well in Cirque du Soleil from Cuba, and they were a flying trapeze troupe. And oh my God, they added some amazing energy to that show. Bunch of like young Cuban lads that were all actually gymnasts, and they'd put this amazing flying act together. And it was a big flying act, so it was a grand volant, big huge swing, but with a cradle catcher, not a swinging catcher.
Oh, nice.
And Juliet had always said, I'd always wanted to do cradle, so why don't you learn how to do that, and then you could be my catcher. And I said, all right, yeah, I'll give that a go. And I just remember I actually went and sat up on the cradle whilst the Cubans were training, and the force, the sheer force of when those flyers came hurtling through the air, and I was right there on the cradle next to the catcher, and just the energy and the power of him punching out to grab this flyer and swinging through the air and then back up and returning him to the bar. And I was like, holy shit. It's like being next to a thoroughbred horse and just the power.
Oh, wow.
It just blew me away. And I was like, oh, okay. I don't know. Anyway, so they had this.
I'm gonna let you go over there and do that whole thing.
Because I was a skinny little, like fucking Kiwi guy that had no training at all, and I sort of had thought, yeah, I can do that. That was always my attitude. Oh yeah, sure, I can do that. They had a coach with them, an older guy, and his name was Vincent, and he was the one that sort of trained them, put the act together. But he actually came over to the UK on tour with them. And he said, okay, if you want to be a catcher, I'll train you to be a catcher. And so he made me get up every morning really early and carry a tent stake and then run around the field carrying tents. Conditioning, basically. Then doing push-ups, doing sit-ups, all this sort of thing. And I was like, how's this cradle? He's like, oh, you need to build a lot of muscle before you can even think about getting up there, boy. He basically broke me and gave me a taste of what was needed in order for me to be able to pursue a career in that discipline. That season finished, and we ended up going to France. I think we'd gone over to see the Cirque du Soleil Festival. This was back when the Cirque du Soleil Festival was in the Cirque d'Hiver building.
Okay, yeah.
And that was the first time I actually saw Aurelia when I think she's 14 at the time, doing her trapeze act, the Cats act at the Cirque d'Hiver.
Yes.
That particular year. And I was like, oh my God, this is another level again. I've just seen some really good stuff. And then there I was at Cirque du Soleil and Cirque d'Hiver and seeing all these amazing things and going, wow, now I've really had my eyes opened to, what's possible, and it just kept getting better and better. So we ended up we sort of just hung around in Paris. We'd bought a truck by that stage as well, 7.5 ton truck, which I volunteered to drive. I had no truck driving license, no truck driving experience. We bought an English truck, 500 pounds, 7.5 ton, in an old caravan. I said, yeah, I'll drive that. And of course, it's right-hand drive. And I'm driving in France on the other side of the road with the steering wheel on the wrong side, no driving license, no insurance. And but it was like, well, you have to do it. And I didn't speak a word of French, which is the other thing. I mean, there wasn't any real relevance. New Zealand was a million miles away from the rest of the world, And so, I turned up in France and I didn't speak a word of French. Juliet, fortunately, she learned a bit of French at school, and so her French was quite good. Well, very good compared to mine. But I just remember driving along and there was no sat nav, obviously. We didn't have, smartphones or anything like that. Winding down the window and going, excuse me, mate, do you know where such and such? And they're just looking at me, go, what? Like, what are you saying? I learned, another lesson. It's like, okay, I need to obviously sort of, when I'm outside of an English-speaking country, I need to start embracing the culture and the language as well. Didn't have a contract for the following season, but we'd met some other circus artists that were staying in the campsite with us, and they said, oh, my cousin's got a show in such and such a place. We showed them the video of Juliet swing and trapeze, and they said, oh my God, that's really good. Why don't you go and see Emilion Buglion, was the name of the show, run by a family called Falchi. And so they put Juliet into the show for the Christmas season after having seen her video. So we stayed there for a little while and saved a bit of money.
So during this time, you're giving like tour husband vibes. Yes, you were
Yeah,
like,
well, I'm driving the truck,
I live for a tour
but it
husband.
was
Yes,
great because I was
yes.
learning so many things just by being on the road as well. Survival things, because there are
Hmm.
things that you don't learn at school, and things that you could only learn by doing it. Basic mechanics, maintenance of the vehicle, that sort of thing. If you're going to be driving a truck,
Sure.
you need to know, okay, where does the oil go? Where does the diesel go? What do you do if you get a flat tire? I used
Yeah.
to hear people say, "Oh, it's a way of life. It's a lifestyle. It's not just a job." And that's so true. It is. It really is. And you have to adapt, and you have to learn as you go. Otherwise, you don't survive it.
Kind of to circle back to what you're doing now, are you learning rigging during this time too? Like I would assume with Wheel of Death, you guys did all the install for that.
Now, I have to say, I think the best lesson that I actually got was when I was working with the circus back in New Zealand, is watching how they lifted up the poles on the tent. By laying out the poles and laying out the cables and then putting the stakes in the ground and working out the angles of where things needed to go. And at the time, I looked at it and I just did not have a clue what was going on at all. But then, slowly but surely, you start to, get a grip of it, and you start to see the physics of how it all works and stuff. And it's, oh, yeah, that's interesting. But it's obviously something I'm never going to attempt on my own, because it's just the sheer scale of it. You're talking about great big bits of steel and huge poles, and
Yeah.
it could go really wrong if you stuffed it up. It's going to go really wrong. Every aspect of circus rigging basically comes back to that. It's about getting something up, stabilizing it, and then guying it off to give it rigidity at certain angles, so that you can then perform something dynamic on it. And that's basically what you're doing with the poles on a circus tent thing. So that was probably about the limit of my knowledge. And then when I did the
Okay.
wheel act with Neville did all the rigging for it. He knew about things like turfers and pulleys and ratchet straps and all that sort of thing, which I didn't know anything about at all. So I just basically used to let him do it, and he would tell me what to do, and then I would just assume that it was safe because he'd put it up. And then when I met Juliet at the Blackpool Tower Circus, because I was flirting with her before I went out with her, I offered to help her with the rigging.
So
Being,
helpful.
I'll be the
Wow.
gallant gent that comes along and helps you carry your bits of steel. So anyway, I went up into the roof of the Tower Circus with her to help her rig, and I put a shackle on, and I put it on completely wrong. I put it on sideways, so basically side loading the shackle. Did up the pin, and I thought, right, obviously that's how you do it. And she came around behind me and corrected it.
Hmm.
Basically said, no, you don't do it that way. You have to do it this way. I actually probably learnt more from Juliet from being with her and touring with her, on the different shows when she was doing her swing and trapeze act, than I did, sort of actually
Wow.
doing anything else up until that point. She would set up her trapeze. She would have like the main pull-up pulleys and ropes that were then diverted off to pulleys on the king pole. Would put her rigging bar onto that. Would have to lift it up, level it off, get it nice and horizontal, because obviously if the bar's not horizontal, then she swings on a funny angle. And then we'd have to guy it off, with the side guys going off to the king poles. And then she set up a lunge system as well. And she had an auto lunge system, which was, at the time, it was like, people just weren't doing it,
Right.
like people that were using lunges would have a lunger on the end of the rope. But she had met this guy called Nicky Dewhurst, whose father, Bryan, I think he was on one of the original, he was on the original Cirque du Soleil show, the Sultan Banco show. I could be completely wrong. But anyway, Nicky and Bryan were tightrope walkers, but Nicky's girlfriend was a trapeze artist, and they had developed this system at the time of putting weights onto the lunge line so that the weight would take up the slack instead of having someone there pulling the slack through on the rope.
Wait, so the lunge is like counterweighted?
Yeah, so it's a lunge line that's got counterweight on it, and then at the bottom of the lunge line where it's anchored is they then had a bungee pack which is then anchored to the ground or anchored to the bottom of the king pole. So basically, as the trapeze artist stood up on the trapeze bar, the weight on the other end of the lunge line would take up the slack.
Oh my God,
All right?
that's so smart.
So it was so an auto lunge system. So anyway, Nicky had explained
I've
the
never
system.
seen that before.
Yeah,
That's wild.
yeah,
That's so smart.
yeah. It just basically means you're self-sufficient. You're not relying on anyone else.
Right.
So you
Yeah,
set the rigging
right.
up yourself. And we ended up developing an auto lunge system like many years later, but for our cradle act as well. So we had a swing and casting cradle act, and we developed an auto lunge system for that, which I don't think I'd seen anyone do at all up until that point. Over the year, Juliet and I, we went from, we stayed in France. We ended up touring in France for 3 years with different shows, not consecutive years. We did a show with Cirque Pender in '96, and then with another show, Cirque Maximum, in 2000, 2001, 2002. And in between times, we'd done a season in Germany, a season in Italy. We'd done a couple of years in Spain, all different shows. And by me touring and going into these different environments, every time I was going into a different environment or into a different big top and working with different aerialists, we had to adapt our rigging, to fit the venue and to work around all these other performers. So it was good. It was like learning through doing. And I'm sure I made a lot of, mistakes. Because there was no one to teach you. You basically, the other artists might give you a little bit of advice, but there was no, at that time, those shows didn't have riggers. The aerialists would take care of their own rigging, and we would just have to learn, through trial and error a lot of the time, as to what worked and what didn't, obviously without taking ridiculously stupid risks. So whilst I was on the road with Juliet, we ended up training up other acts as well. We did a doubles quarterlies act, and we trained up a small flying act, which we toured in France for a year as well, a Petit Volant act. And then latterly, the Casting Cradle act. But where was I going with this now?
You're just telling your life story. Yeah.
We toured up until about the mid-2000s. We were in Europe. But we would go back. We'd go back to the UK in between contracts normally, because with a touring season, your contract would normally probably start around March and it would finish Christmas. So you'd have 2 or 3 months in between. So that would be the time we would hook up the caravan onto the truck. We'd get the ferry back we'd drive to wherever we were, like Calais or whatever, and get the ferry across to Dover, and then end up back in London, and we'd park up in the yard at the circus space. But back then, they used to let people do that. They don't do that anymore.
Well, it's not called Circus Space anymore.
No, it's all the National Centre of Circus Arts now. Yeah, exactly. But they were definitely a lot more closely affiliated to circus back then, where they would actually bring people in from the circus to share their skills and to train and to teach whilst they were there. Meow, sorry. But it's gone down sort of, it's gone down the road now of obviously being, it's a university now. And when we were there, it was run, the CEO was a guy called Teo Greenstreet, and Charlie Holland was the general manager. And they'd both come from circusy backgrounds. Charlie done a bit of juggling and Teo done unicycling and street shows. But it grew and grew and grew and got to the point where it had become a university and they're offering a degree in circus. And so arts administrators were brought in from councils and what have you. And they didn't really like the idea of people living in caravans and trucks in the middle of London in the back of their building, and had a bit of a freak out about it. So that's kind of when they cut the ties, I feel, with real circus anyway.
Interesting.
But up until that point, we would go back, in between, over a period of 10 years while we're touring around Europe. Every year we'd go back there, we'd park up, we'd train, we'd put a new act together, we'd go back out and we'd do another season. Well, not necessarily put a whole new act together, but embellish, what we already had, get some good tuition and get some good tricks in there and stuff, and then go back out again. And that's the way it was for, a decade. When we did eventually stop touring, I think we'd done 2 consecutive years in France by that stage, and we'd come back in 2003. The circus space were looking for a new head of aerial to run their aerial department on the degree course, and Juliette got the job basically, and she saw that as an opportunity to maybe look at going in a different direction, and buying some property instead of living in a caravan for the rest of her life, getting a real job, with a salary, with a weekly salary and what have you. And I, by that point, I suppose, had accumulated, a certain amount of information and knowledge from a rigging perspective that people at the circus school didn't have. They were just rigging slings onto a truss, and I was like, well, you could use a pulley and then you can lift it and lower it and change the height, and just things like that. So the knowledge that I had, I suppose, was different to some of the what they were doing at the time at the circus space.
Strikes me, Bryan, also just to expand on that is,
Yeah.
I've talked to other riggers before who talk about acrobatic rigging, and they talk about rigging to structures or, very much from like an aerial perspective.
Yeah.
But I think what you bring and what's so different about your level and layers of experience
Yeah.
is you're not only used to setting up aerial on something,
Yeah.
but you're used to setting up, or like you have the knowledge to set up these huge, large scale structures. Like when I met you was in Ireland, and you were putting up that huge, like, beast of a structure, that
Yeah.
Chantal
Yeah.
McCormick has over there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just like such an important skill set. And I'm wondering how many people in the world have that capacity now.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly, understanding the structure that you're rigging from and being able to, put a structure up, I suppose, to then utilize to do your creative rigging from is certainly an asset, because it just gives you more flexibility with creativity as well. I mean, the skills
Yeah.
that I learned, sort of like whilst I was with the circus, were I just met some really generous people people that are just generous as friends and generous with their time and their knowledge. There's one guy in particular that I met in my last touring years, a guy called Jeannot, who was however many generations circus boy that could do everything. Drive trucks, weld, fix big tops, fix camions, do everything. But he taught me the basics of welding, basically, and we made a fly rig. We welded a fly rig, and that was the year that we actually trained up a flying act. And he was one of the flyers in the act, and he's like, right, let's build the rig, and then let's train on it whilst we're touring and doing shows. So he taught me the basics of welding as well. So I then went into prop fabrication. When we did end up back in London at the circus space, I ended up making trapezes and hoops and all sorts of things for everyone, because I was the only one that knew one of the only people there at the time that knew how to weld. So having all of those different skills, the driving as well, driving plant, machinery, telehandlers, forklifts, lends itself to putting up structures as well. Then understanding how the structures, different ways of lifting structures as well. Do you lift it using plant, or do you lift it using lifting accessories like steel wire rope lever hoists and winches, all that sort of thing. So just learning different ways of being able to do things, because you're not always in the same environment. Sometimes you might be. I've put up structures that are right next to a river, for example, for a high wire, where there's no way that you could lay something down and then lift it up. So you need to bring in some type of machinery to do it. So it's just being able to think laterally, I suppose, outside of the bubble of different ways of, doing things and finding solutions, I suppose. So I suppose that sort of has made what we do, as part of the company now, like quite employable, I guess, is that we can find different ways of doing things. Walk into a venue and say, right, we need to put a substructure in here, or we need to modify this, or we need to change that before we can actually put the rigging in. So
yeah. I was talking to Lindsay Butcher actually for the podcast, a great aerial dancer, and we were speaking about rigging and about like the creative design aspect of rigging. It kind of goes along with like this problem solving thing that you're talking about. And I'm wondering how much, especially because I know you work with aerial dance, you work with traditional circuses or contemporary circuses, you work now in film a little bit.
Yeah.
How much are you thinking about like the very practical side of it? Like keep everyone alive, make sure the thing is structural, make sure the thing you're hanging from is on a thing that's structural.
Yeah.
And how much of it is kind of listening to what the artists have a vision for and trying to make that happen?
Well, very much so. It has to be symbiotic, because without the artists, we don't have a job, basically. There's no point in putting up a rig just to look at it. It's like the artists have to have the vision, first of all. They have to say, right, this is what I want to do. This is artistically what I want it to look like. And then we will then go, right, okay, so this is what you want it to look like. This is what you need it to do. How can we do that? How can we make that happen in this space, so that you are getting the effect, artistically that you want, but also at the same time making it practical, and then obviously keeping it safe as well. And
Yeah, sure.
I think aerial performers are better at that than visionaries like directors. We have directors, creative directors, a lot of the time. So we'll work on a musical production or a theatre piece or a film piece. And okay, film's different again because you can do anything on film. You can cheat it, but in live, live theatre, musical theatre, that sort of thing. The director will say, right, I want someone to fly from the upper circle, and they're going to swoop over the audience, and they're going to go under the proscenium, and then they're going to land up over there. And it's like, okay. So practically speaking, you need to put, wires here, there, and wherever in order to achieve that, which means that, for example, your curtains won't close or the fire iron can't come down because you've got cables going through it. So it's about, finding a balance between what they want to achieve artistically and what's practically possible. And then also a large part of that comes down to budget as well, because there are always ways of doing it. There's always solutions, but sometimes you need to spend a lot of money in order to be able to achieve that. And unfortunately, a lot of the smaller to mid-scale touring companies don't have big budgets to, be spending on buying automation or, reels of Dyneema, that sort of thing. So we have to find alternative solutions. And sometimes it's a compromise between their vision and practicality. But it's really important that you embrace, the artistic vision of a project. Absolutely. But that's good, sort of like the performers that we work with as well. I mean, all the guys, all the riggers that work with Joe and I, Joe, my business partner, we're all from an aerial stroke acrobatic background as well. So all the freelance riggers that we bring in have been aerialists or been trampolinists or been acrobats. And so
That's so cool.
Yeah, we can talk to the performers and they can explain what they need, and we get it. We understand. It's like, okay, yep. So you need to be able to do this move and that move, and you need to be able to have a harness that will enable you to do that. If we're putting something up for them, they feel like they're in safe hands because we know what it is that they're going through because we've done it. So obviously we know how seriously they take their lives, and and we do too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Have you noticed certain trends in aerial or rigging and structural performance, like things that artists will ask you certain years that like everyone kind of wants?
I've noticed a big move away from big acts these days. When I first got into the scene, sort of in London at the circus space, it was all about flying trapeze, swinging trapeze, cord volant, cradle, bascule, teeterboard, all things that require a troop of people and big props and lots of space. And I've definitely noticed a huge swing towards single point solo stuff where people can be self-contained. They don't need to rely. They're not relying on a troop of people, because the thing is, you put a fly troop together or a teeterboard troop together, someone gets injured or someone decides they're going to go off and do something else, and then the whole thing falls apart. Unless, if you're coming from like more of a traditional circus family background, that doesn't happen. The family stays together. But I found that they wanted to take these traditional circus skills and put them into a new circus environment, and it doesn't last. It doesn't last. You'll get generations of trapeze families that are still going, and people that are flying around and they're in their 50s and they're still doing it. But it just doesn't work in a new circus environment because of the fact that they're all individuals and they're not family, and so they do leave. They go off, being self-contained, being self-sufficient.
I also think there's a budget issue to this as well.
There is, absolutely. Practical, yeah. It's got to do with logistics as well, transportation, storage. Where are we going to store stuff? How are we transporting it?
Yeah, if you can't park your caravan in the back of the National Circus School in London, where are you supposed to put your shit?
Yeah, they don't have trucks. They don't have the facilities to be able to do that, necessarily. But I've also found that as a result of, sort of the trend going in more in that direction, is that the level has increased exponentially because of the fact that there's so many more people doing it. There's so much more competition. And in order to stand out and be different, you actually have to be really bloody good, as well. And yeah, I've just seen, like people that have just evolved into like beautiful aerial creatures, and seeing people start and then seeing where they are now is just, it's amazing, and I'm sure you have seen that journey through a few people yourself, over the years.
It is. Yeah. It's really amazing. Another controversial yet brave topic.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on rigging from trees? I always have to ask every rigger who
I,
comes
I,
on.
yeah, I know that. Like the what do they call them? The rigging police on these online safety groups, and just
Yeah.
it's like you can't. It's just like, oh right, here we go again. Of course, you
Yeah.
can rig from trees. Yeah, of course, people have been doing it for years, swinging around on ropes from trees. But you just have to do it properly. If you do, I mean, we regularly asked by high profile clients for private weddings and big parties in the south of France or in the islands or in Italy. They want to have a big wedding and they want to have aerial performers hanging from their trees whilst they're having a garden party. So we'll bring in, obviously, someone who knows about trees, an aerial, trees, a tree specialist, like a tree surgeon, to go and do a site visit. So it's like, yes, you have to have the budget. You're going to fly them out there along with a rigger. We're going to have a look at the tree, and the tree surgeon is going to assess its suitability and look at things like access and all that sort of stuff.
The tree surgeon?
The tree surgeon, that's what they're called, tree surgeons.
He's got a little scalpel. Like what?
No, but I mean, arborists, I
Yeah, I
think,
know
but
what you
yeah,
mean. Yeah.
tree surgeons, yeah.
Love
But
it.
they'll go and they'll have a look and they'll assess the tree, and then we will, bring the tree specialist, the tree surgeon, on the gig with us. Now, we're quite lucky in our company because one of my business partner's closest friends two of them are actually tree surgeons. So we'll say, hey, we've got a great gig in the south of France, or how do you feel about 5-star hotel for a few nights and having a look at a tree and a good fee?
There you are.
But yes, no, I'm not condoning the cowboy sort of practice of just sling a rope over and hope for the best. You need to do it properly, and you need to consult someone who knows what they're doing, and that means sort of like having the budget to do it and pay them, to do a job properly. Then that's the way it needs to be done. But yeah, no, of course you can do it. Yeah.
Love it. That is the running theme, right? You've got to invest in some of this.
Yeah.
I think it's just the reality. And along those lines are like business lines. I'm curious because you're talking about these high profile clients or these big, events. Do you book those, or is there a production company that books you independently who also brings in the aerialists?
There's many different ways it happens, many different ways. I mean, in the events industry, traditionally, what will happen is you'll have a production company that will then bring in an entertainment agency, maybe, who will then book the artists. The artists will then potentially say, right, well, we need a rigging company to oversee the installation, so they will recommend us potentially.
Cool.
But that's I would say how it would work the majority of the time. But then there are several production companies and there are several entertainment agencies that would come direct to us as well. They say, right, we're putting on an event. We need aerial. Can you come and assess the suitability of this venue? And then they will say, right, you can do swing and trapeze in there, or you can only do sort of like low dynamic, low impact sort of solo stuff. So then they can actually go and say, right, this is to their client. They can pitch an idea, having had us go in and do an initial assessment. And then we have other times as well where clients will come directly to us to provide the artists as well. We do, we work with all the performers on a regular basis. So we have some clients that will say, can you provide, this, this, and this, and do the installation? So, yeah, there's several ways it works. Yeah, in the events industry. Yeah, but the events industry, sort of in the UK, like for about 10 years up until just before the recession, it was phenomenal. I mean, it was just every night of the week, gig, 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 gig. It was just, back then as well, like the Middle East was really exploding. They're building new hotels and shopping centres, and they didn't have the people living there at the time. The artists weren't there. This is back sort of, 20 years ago. And so they would pay for all of us to fly out from the UK, all the performers, all the riggers, and put us up and pay for all the accommodation and everything as well. But obviously now that's changed because Dubai and places like that, the Middle East has grown massively and everyone lives out there now. Not everyone, but, there's a big, large pool of performers.
Yeah, right. Enough people where it's like you don't have to bring...
But that whole events industry right up until sort of like that big recession in 2008 was just, it was unreal. Yeah, and it's the whole circus aerial side of things has crossed over into so many different like genres now. It's not just the events industry and circus. or cabaret, film, music, pop videos, musical theatre. It's everywhere. It's fitness studios. People want to do aerial to keep fit now. It's not just going to the gym and lifting weights. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a massive industry.
How do you find, and I don't know a lot about your exposure to North American rigging
Yeah,
or riggers or practices, but I'm
yeah.
interested to know if you have any and what you see the difference between like a British model,
Mm,
which is not a European model, but I feel like they're
mm,
closer to each other,
yeah.
right? And then the North American model. Do you see any differences in standards and practices?
I don't really know. Being online now, it's wonderful, because having
Mm,
access to all this information, being able to chat with people on these different forums and stuff. And there are some very good online groups that are circus performer flying rigging groups. And I see that the standards and the practices are very similar, to be honest. I mean, there's a
okay.
wrong way
Yeah.
and there's a right way at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's safe or it's not safe. But yeah, I mean, obviously the terminology sometimes is slightly different. And obviously in the States, you're still using the imperial measurements.
Sorry.
No, don't apologise. It's good. It keeps things interesting.
Oh.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but no, like,
Happy to help.
yeah, generally though,
Oh man.
things are very, very, very similar.
Yeah,
And
okay.
it's good as well. We're sharing knowledge as well. Like we'll question each other and say, so what do the American standards say about this? And I was, what do the British standards say about that? And then obviously, there's the European standards as well. And there's some very knowledgeable people, in all those areas. And they're quite sort of willing to share and discuss things. I mean, sometimes there's a little bit of headbutting going on, but, that's pretty rare.
It's to be expected.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting, like, because I was thinking, it's kind of, I don't know if people could get the experience that you got the way you got it these days. Like you're saying, like, people don't
Yeah.
run away and join the circus anymore. It's so much more standardized, so much more codified.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Unless you're
No.
part of a family, the barrier of
Yeah.
entry is so much greater,
Yeah. Yeah. No,
or formalized.
absolutely. Yeah. 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 No, I mean,
And even from the rigging perspective, like, how do you learn the
No,
things that
you're
you
right.
learned?
You're right. You're right. It's really difficult. We get contacted regularly. People email us saying, "Oh, look, I'd really like to get into the circus rigging performer flying business. How do you do it? I mean, where do you go to get qualified?" And it's like, it's that eternal question. Rigging qualifications. There aren't really any acrobatic rigging qualifications as such. It's a combination of different accreditations and experience that go towards being able to demonstrate competency. And we basically, when we started, there were no companies as such really that I was aware of that were specialising in doing the circusy style of rigging. There were plenty of other companies, around doing performer flying stuff. I mean, very, very good companies, like Freedom Flying and Flying by Foy and doing all that sort of, theatrical flying. But there wasn't really anyone doing the dynamic sort of circusy flying stuff outside of the circus environment. And so it was a
Right.
natural, obvious direction to go once we stopped touring and stopped performing. I say I mean me and I had a business partner that I worked with, Joe, who was also an aerialist, and we met each other around the same time and sort of were getting involved in that rigging side of things at the same time. And it was just happened to be in the right place at the right time. I feel to get in there and do that. With people coming into it now, I mean, my advice to them would be, look, if you really want to do it, just start up your own company and do it. Which is what
Mm.
we did. Make yourself the
Yeah,
specialist.
but you had like a years and years and years of experience before you started up the company. I don't know if it's like
Yeah,
would
years of circus
like
experience. Yeah, of
yeah, that's it.
working under a big top, which
Yeah,
definitely helped. Of course, it did. Yeah, yeah. But
yeah,
I suppose, coming into it now, if I think like a good starting point basically is like if you're not haven't had any aerial performance experience necessarily, is to go and do a working at height course. I always say to people, go and do a
mm,
working at height course, something like a SPRAT course or an IRATA course, which is like industrial rope access, working with ropes and harnesses, just because it gives you a good understanding of the use of the gear, of the correct use of the gear, things like pulleys and carabiners and ropes and how they should be correctly utilized. So I think that's a good starting point. And also, it will give you a pretty good idea of have you got a head for heights for a start, you know.
Hmm.
You'd be surprised at the amount of riggers that I know that are terrified of going up a bloody ladder. Or, you know, they've got a good understanding of rigging, but they don't have a good head for heights. And I know some very good riggers that are terrified of heights. They're comfortable in their own environment.
Who?
Yeah, don't ask that question. You can't ask that
Name.
question.
No, just kidding.
Yeah. You know, no, we have some riggers that are technically,
yeah,
you know, they have all the knowledge, but actually putting them in a harness up in the air, how agile are you at swinging around from the rafters and putting in the points? You know, I mean, not that we necessarily have to rely on doing that all the time. We try and find ways of, you know, minimizing risks by putting people at, you know, in harnesses and ropes at height to do the rigging, by putting them into things like powered access, like scissor lifts or cherry pickers, or using gantries, existing access gantries in venues. But I feel, you know, sort of, you do need to have a good head for heights if you're going to be working as an aerial rigger, unless you're sort of like the administration side that does the planning and the, you know, the method statements and load calculations and stuff. But being able to implement that, I feel that we had an advantage because we were aerialists and we were quite strong. We had good upper body strength and we could climb and swing and hang on ropes and do the work as well. You know, so it's all fine sort of about knowing how to get to the point, but once you're there, how do you install it? That's another thing as well, you know, sort of like the access side of things, like the rope access doesn't always teach you about how to actually do the rigging. It will teach you about how to get to the point safely and get down safely, but, you know, putting it in. So there's lots of different facets.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think that rigging is such a male-dominated industry?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, there are definitely women in it. I find the same thing with aerial, though. You know, the aerial industry is very heavily dominated by women. You know, the majority of aerialists I found are women. There's not so many men in it. And I don't honestly know the answer to that,
which is
Shannon.
one of the which is why I think it's so weird that like you're saying, like it really helps to be an aerialist, and like as an aerialist, people ask me like what makes your job so special, and I'm always like, well, not that way, but like what's in the skill set of being an aerialist, and I always say like knowing at least how to rig your own equipment. You know,
absolutely.
like an aerialist should at least, any act that you do, you should know the rigging and the specs behind it. But
no, I mean,
to make that leap to be like a rigger, it seems like happens for men more than it does for women.
Yeah, and I don't honestly know. I'm assuming the only thing, well, that I can think of is that maybe they enjoy it more. The men enjoy doing it more than the women do, because it's certainly not a thing about strength. It's not, because you know, you've got the machinery to do it. You use the lifting accessories. You don't. It's technique. It's not brute force. So it's not about that. I guess maybe it's just something that maybe men enjoy, that side of things maybe a little bit more than women. I do know some very good, you know, women riggers, but yeah, you're right. There aren't that many of them, and I honestly don't know the reason why.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're circling around to the end. Is there anything that like you feel like the children need to hear?
No, I don't feel that. I don't think there's anything that they need to hear. I mean, it was just basically sort of like you asked me, sort of, how have I always been a rigger? And I sort of like tripped over my own tongue then and said, no, I used to be a magician, and oh God, where am I going?
I know that was a leading question. That was a leading question, Bryan, because I already knew that the answer was no.
Yeah,
and I wanted to hear the story behind the no. So.
I'm not. It was certainly like for me a very interesting journey to get to where I am today, and I don't know if I articulated it particularly well, to be honest. But it doesn't matter. It's just good to have a chat and sort of, you know,
Oh my God, yeah, that's the best part.
Yeah.
Final question, which you've already kind of answered, but let's just reiterate because it never hurts to say the thing again.
Yeah.
Never hurts to repeat yourself. Never hurts to go back over and say the same thing and I'm just doing it over.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to yourself at the beginning of your career?
Yeah, well, I have thought about this because I knew you were going to ask it, because you ask everyone. And I'd say, if I could go back in time and tell myself when I stopped touring and moved to like the party capital of London, which is Shoreditch in East London, I'd say, avoid credit cards and casinos. Because you never win. You never win, all right? Go chasing debt with credit cards is a bad thing to do. But no, seriously, I mean, I have thought about it, and I thought, actually, I don't think that there is any advice I would give myself, just because I've really enjoyed the journey that I've had so far to get where I am today, that I wouldn't want to change any of it. I'm happy with the friends that I've got. I'm happy with where I'm living here in Ireland. I'm happy with the business that I've got. And every single thing that I've done has led me here to where I am now. And so if I went back in time, it would be that thing like if I tell myself something, I might end up taking a different tangent, because I've never had a plan for life, you see. I've always just followed my nose. So if I changed that, I might not be here at where I am now, and I might actually be worse off, So I don't think I'd give myself any advice.
Why risk it? That's true. Oh, that's beautiful. Well, Bryan, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This was
worries.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So appreciate it. Soldiering through. We did it.
Yes, we did it. We got there eventually, yes. And thank you for not letting me bail, because, I had to consider it. I was just like, what am I doing? I've been up all night. I've had no sleep. And anyway,
I know.
It doesn't matter.
But you know what the thing is, Bryan? I know you, and I know this is always going to be true about you. You're always going to be working, and you're always going to have no sleep. So here we are.
Yep.
Thanks for listening, friends, fans, and foes. I'll talk at you next week. In the meantime, go to patreon.com/theartistathlete and show some love, send some support, just like these fine Patreons that you're about to hear the voices of right now. The Artist Athlete podcast is supported solely by donations from people like you. Here's what some of those people have to say.
Hi, my name is Noah and I do hand balancing. Hi, my name is Woody and I do Leo walk. Thank you for listening to the Artist Athlete podcast.
Hi everyone, I'm Dominique, a ground acrobat, trapeze artist, and coach, currently bringing circus to the extremely cold but very beautiful Northern Ontario, Canada. Circus has changed my life and I'm so grateful to everyone in this community. Find me on Instagram at DomUpsideDown or my website domupsidedown.com.
Aloha, my name is Beth Russell and I live on the beautiful island of Maui, Hawaii. I am an aerial artist and movement instructor specializing in chakra yoga to keep me balanced and grounded. I play with silks, trapeze, lyra, rope, acro, aerial yoga and dance, slacklining, pole, bungee, and climbing. Really anything that goes up and allows me to explore 3D space. You can find my dedicated aerial page on Instagram at Maui Aerialist. If you find yourself coming to Maui, let's play.
Hey there, friends, fans, and enemies. This is Chris Alston, Patreon of the Artist Athlete podcast, straps artist and lyra performer and acrobat out of Greenville, South Carolina. So if you're ever passing through, make sure to stop in and see me and my friends. We have a wonderful space and we'd love to see you.
Hi, my name is Erica Lee. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm an aerialist. I teach performing arts to elementary school during the day and do pole and swing and rope by night. I really, really like the Artist Athlete podcast because it gives me a lot of circus goals to look forward to. It gives me a lot of insight on what's going on around the world in circus, and that's why I'm Patreon.
Hello all. Thank you for tuning in to the Artist Athlete podcast. I am Opal Schwartz from Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you're ever in the city, feel free to stop by the Aviary Minneapolis. It's a great time. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and goodbye.
Hey there, artists and athletes. This is Andy Smith, owner and artistic director at Saltaire Circus School in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. And I want to thank you for contributing to the Artist Athlete podcast. If you ever find yourself down in Florida, come check us out. Whether you're an artist, athlete, or someone ordinary just looking to be extraordinary, we got a place for you.